Understand democracy isn't founded on the idea that our political leaders are saviors. It's the opposite. They are just representatives. You are the real saviors, and they just represent you. When we make politicians saviors in our mind, we actually give power to wealthy interests and take the first step towards authoritarianism, no matter how good those politicians are in fact. Because when we put the emphasis for change on a leader's personal character, we remove ourselves from that central role of being the ones who make the change or drive that leader to make the change. Because once you start to think of the things that you're seeing as tools, once you start to think proactively about every crisis in terms of the opportunities within it, all of this stuff becomes much, much easier to do. And the amount of time spent feeling bad about a situation diminishes, and the amount of time realizing the actions you can take increases, which is more efficient. So if you want to get rid of the real deep state, learn from the corporate public relations professionals who make it up. Here are 3 things to do in response to those 3 factors when it comes to changing your strategic thinking. Firstly, in order to deal with these factors, no matter who you're thinking of voting for, if you're thinking of voting for somebody, think about what they'll be like as an opponent, because no matter how much you like them, they will at times be your opponent in between that election cycle. They're not going to save the day. They're just a means to the end of you saving the day. You don't follow leaders, make them follow you. You need to keep working, too, on that community level to make change locally while also making new contacts elsewhere, working in similar causes nationally and internationally. This is not just to have a backup for when political leaders fail, but it's in order to maximize your leverage on their decision-making by building up local autonomy and interconnections between local communities that corporate voices don't control. We talk about this in a previous podcast episode called Your Community Can Drive the Transition to Renewables. Don't wait for the state. It isn't local versus national or international progress. It isn't grassroots versus political process. It isn't a choice of voting or going to protests. The best movements find how all forms of progress can reinforce each other and then use those different forms in conjunction. 2. Understand that voting is super important, but so is engaging politicians between elections. Even if you make compromises in terms of what you want to see in the short term, even if you elect someone you like, never stop advocating for more. Never appease the center of the debate. Instead, shift the center to your view of things by using framing and metaphors that match what the center will understand, but still carry a radical message. Control the narrative. Don't let it control you, because no one respects a movement or a cause that stands for nothing. Never really compromise. Treat every crisis as an opportunity. Track your wins as much as your losses. Never think that you will achieve anything unless a politician is under pressure to do even more than it. And encourage them. Make it clear to them that what is possible is much more ambitious than what they believe to be possible. Keep the ground moving in your direction, slowly or fast, depending upon the situation, but never disarm your arguments by voluntarily giving up the leverage you hold. Even if you choose not to be too radical in a situation, always have that radicality ready to go, and always try to control the framing of what is realistic and push that framing towards the truth. 3. We need our own army of lobbyists, and that army is you. You are the PR person, the lobbyist. Every time you call your elected leaders, protest outside that city council, or encourage your friends to vote, or support policies that help ease strain on people's lives and therefore give them more capacity to participate in the political process. Welcome to a special episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, part of a new sub-series we'll be running on some Saturdays. We're calling this new sub-series Sovereignty Saturdays, and the common theme to these episodes will be a focus on countering attempts by the US government to annex Canada with an environmental lens. If you haven't yet, make sure not to miss our previous 4 episodes of Sovereignty Saturdays. Around the world, democracy is under attack, and far from secondary, environmental and energy issues are core to understanding what's happening. The erosion of rights and democracy anywhere harms us all and hurts our ability to address climate change, biodiversity loss, and to make the changes we need to make to have a safe, renewable future. Wealthy polluters have identified their main obstacle to continuing to profit from pollution. That obstacle is democracy. I'm your host, Connor Curtis, Head of Communications at Sierra Club Canada. Today's episode is the first of a few that we are going to be running talking about the real deep state, so stay tuned. There is a real, shadowy group of people out there who control large portions of our governments. It's the oil and gas corporate lobby and public relations people working for wealthy interests. They direct and bend policy. They often determine how much you are taxed versus a wealthy person or corporation, what services you receive, and what environmental crises you will face. And they want you out of the picture of decision making. More to the point, they want you to believe that someone else is manipulating things behind the scenes instead of them. They want you to believe it's civil servants, or some minority group, or marginalized group that they can direct racism or hatred at. They want you to believe that it's immigrants. The blame will shift to anyone else, anyone they can cast as other. They know no national allegiance to Canada, and oil and gas public relations representatives are often heavily tied to U.S. interests. Yet their accomplices in the climate denial community will lie to you and tell you to blame anyone else for the problems Canada faces instead of corporate actions or those of the ultra-wealthy. That is specific. It is to find the people in a society who can be cast as other and to keep pushing on that node until you have the power necessary to destroy the democracy that society functioned underneath. This scapegoating of the other is actually something very strategic that extremist elements tend to use, and that has been used historically before. I'll link below to a podcast by a different podcaster that actually goes into this from a historical perspective. But that scapegoating is specifically a tool developed by extremist groups to destroy democracies in countries and replace them with authoritarian dictatorships. So do not fall for it or accept its framing of the situations and the real problems that we face. For instance, immigrants who came to this country like my grandparents once did, often with very little but the desire to be safer and have the opportunities we all have, who contribute to building many of the things we take for granted here, have become one of the most recent scapegoats for these wealthy interests. In reality, the real deep state is the person in the suit and tie, the person who very obviously has power. You need only look at rising inequality to see it. The public relations professionals and lobbyists who work for wealthy individuals and big corporations, that's the real deep state. And they have done everything in their power to try and keep people from seeing the obvious. It's partially conspiracy. There really is a coordinated effort, for instance, to lie about climate change by oil and gas corporations. But beyond conspiracy, it's mostly self-interest that drives them. Some PR people working for wealthy interests like oil and gas corporations may not even be fully conscious that what they're doing is wrong, but they're doing it anyway, for a paycheck. But here's the thing. We have the upper hand. There are more of us out there than them, and wealth alone isn't everything in a fight. If we understand the strategy and tactics of oil and gas corporate lobbyists and public relations professionals, we can shift the balance of power back to people. That also means addressing the climate crisis and rising wealth inequality at their roots, something we've talked about in our previous No King's Day special of Sovereignty Saturdays. We need to do everything we can to increase people's capacity to engage in the political process, both in terms of skills and knowledge, but also in terms of material capacity and time. But for today, I want to look at two things. Firstly, we'll be doing some reflection on Canada's Budget 2025 announced this week, the good and the bad, a sort of case study in how corporate and wealthy influence works. I'm also making this assessment shortly after the budget was released, so take it with a grain of salt that we may learn more in coming weeks as further analysis is done. Secondly, I want to go over the actual ways you can strategically start to think like an oil and gas lobbyist or PR person and use their tools for the sake of environmental progress and democracy. I'll be going over, and I want to emphasize this, strategies, not tactics. As we covered in a previous episode of Sovereignty Saturdays called Winning the Communications War of the U.S. Oligarchy, strategies are the broad strokes of how you seek to make change, whereas tactics are the tool belt of actions you take in the moment depending on how your strategy interacts with that situation you're facing. It's vital not only to get caught up in a negative. So on Budget 2025, here's some good and bad and maybe a few opportunities. Because even if you're looking at the budget and feeling down as a result, the first thing I encourage you to practice is to see the opportunity in every crisis. I could say to you that the 2025 budget and the climate competitiveness strategy released in it are a letdown. And in many ways, they were for the environment, showing a distinct lack of ambition on climate action and green economy growth. I'm recording this on Thursday, November 6, 2025, a couple of days after the budget was released, and analyses will keep coming in throughout the week on the budget and strategy, but already there's alarm over a few things, including more subsidies for oil and gas, weakened greenwashing regulations, weakened emissions reductions targets and regulations around that for big corporations, and plans for wasteful and dangerous investments in nuclear energy, given that renewables like solar and wind, combined with battery storage and grid upgrades, are more efficient and sustainable investments. Indeed, as the Energy Mix's Mitchell Beer reports, the 2025 budget cites the Darlington nuclear project outside Toronto, which will rely on uranium from the United States, as an example of investing where it counts in a new Buy Canada policy. It's a move that I would say is neither Buy Canadian nor particularly competitive for a climate competitiveness strategy. There is also alarm over those increased subsidies for oil and gas projects. Again, the Energy Mix reports here that there will be an allocation of $1 billion in tax incentives for natural gas facilities or LNG facilities that go into operation before 2030. This is a dangerous use of subsidies towards an industry facing a global oversupply of liquefied natural gas, which makes any new LNG development pointless as an investment. We've detailed the economic futility and health issues inherent in liquefied natural gas development in a link I'll put in the description. But it's important to note LNG Canada, for instance, is actually a foreign-owned joint venture of Shell, Petronas, PetroChina, Mitsubishi Corporation, and Korea Gas. Meanwhile, other proposed LNG projects are backed by U.S. interests tied to the current U.S. administration. These LNG subsidies are also not popular with Canadians. They come even though, as of June 2025, fewer than 1 in 5 Canadians want their tax dollars going to largely foreign-owned companies to build more LNG projects. And this comes as 72% of Albertans wish to maintain or increase federal climate action and action to transition the country to clean energy. All this also comes despite the fact that polling in March showed 65% of Canadians want renewables instead of oil and gas development, and polling in June 2025 confirms 67% of Canadians now prefer renewables and clean energy to oil and gas development, and it's 77% in BC. We are also alarmed coming out of this budget and climate strategy to see the weakening of relatively recent greenwashing rules which were wildly popular with the Canadian public. Polling hosted by the Angus Reid Forum in September 2024 found 93% of Canadians support anti-greenwashing legislation. These rules had already led to large, well-funded oil and gas lobby groups having to pull down whole sections of their websites or parts of their social media because even they did not have a record of how much and when they had lied on behalf of oil and gas corporations that they represent. The rules were more than a major win for climate truthfulness, too. What we are seeing in the United States in terms of a breakdown of democratic processes, rights, and freedoms is in large part due to the spread of disinformation and specifically climate denial. This climate denial and delayist messaging has been purposefully spread by oil and gas corporations to undermine democratic processes. Canada needs stronger regulations like anti-greenwashing legislation to ensure that oil and gas corporations who have huge amounts of money to spend on influence are held to the highest possible standard of truthfulness. The weakening of greenwashing rules is more than just a problem for the climate. It is a problem for the security of our democracy. Also importantly, the removal of greenwashing rules actually makes it harder to tell which projects are really nation building and which are not. And this is a problem for investors as well. There are several quotes on this I'd like to read you from that Energy Mix article. The government's proposal to weaken greenwashing provisions means more investor risk, particularly given the reluctance of provincial securities regulators to enforce accurate and complete disclosure in climate matters. Matt Price, Executive Director of Investors for Paris Compliance, responded in a release. Removing the Competition Act amendments lets polluters mislead people in Canada and undermines truly sustainable business, added Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, one of the leading advocates for this legislation. Such needless retreat on climate and sustainable finance policy from a government led by Mark Carney is not something many experts would have expected, said Adam Scott, Executive Director of Shift Action for Pension Wealth and Planet Health. With the future stability and competitiveness of Canada's economy on the line, we need much stronger leadership in the face of relentless industry lobbying. Canada needs credible guardrails in place to ensure the stability of our financial system and the climate. You can find that article linked below. And as some people have pointed out, even if there was a concern over companies not talking about their green credentials and progress for fear of anti-greenwashing laws, one can actually also institute laws that would ensure mandatory disclosure of progress, which would be good, because then you would have companies having to report on their actual progress on emissions reductions rather than simply greenwashing and getting away with it because there's no law there to stop them. As you can see, there's a lot in this budget that actually makes Canada more vulnerable to the United States and not less. And I doubt very much that was intentional. But leaders only know as much as they are told and only do as much as they are pushed to do, or they feel they have the room to do. These weaknesses in the budget that expose us to United States influence and continued reliance on a dying oil and gas industry are first and foremost the result of corporate lobbying that pulled the budget and climate plan in that direction. The deep state was hard at work. This stark contrast between what Canadians actually want and what they got out of Budget 2025 is indicative of the divide corporate lobbyists tried to place between political leaders and the public. Environmental Defense reported last year in 2024 fossil fuel companies and industry associations had at least 1,135 lobby meetings with the federal government. While that's a high rate of meetings between all of us as climate-concerned individuals, we could outnumber those meetings if every one of us just were to meet once with their MP or another representative. But we are not encouraged to engage with leaders. That's the real trick of the real deep state, to convince us that we can leave the political system be and just vote every 4 years, or try to convince us not to vote at all, or try to put up fake choices between engaging in local change or engaging in the national political system, or fake choices between only going to protests or only calling MPs, when in reality it's not a choice of one or the other tactic, it's about using all of them together. And even though public opinion favors climate action, too many Canadians have been misled about the viability of renewable energy. They've been told myths about it being unreliable or even dangerous that were spread by oil and gas interests who do not want competition. Or they were told that oil and gas is green when it was not. That's why it's so important to talk to people on the fence about renewable energy and climate action and clear up those misconceptions, without wasting time trying to convince outright climate deniers who have no interest in hearing the truth to begin with. Or similarly, only ever talking to people we already agree with completely and who don't need to change their mind because they already agree with us. And here, it's important to understand what positive things in the budget and climate strategy came out on Tuesday, because there are opportunities within them. The budget wasn't all bad news either. A youth climate corps was established in Budget 2025 with a commitment of $40 million over 2 years. There are intentions to continue to proceed with climate policies like clean electricity regulations and methane regulations, as well as to continue industrial carbon pricing. All of these are good things, but their effectiveness is going to come down to local support for them and accountability for corporations locally. And the specifics of the budget are not the only story to tell, particularly with regards to the emissions cap. If you haven't already, you can go back and listen to some episodes of this podcast where we talk to, for instance, survivors of climate impacts in Canada, like wildfires and floods, who actually traveled to Ottawa to tell their stories and to call for this emissions cap. And it is an emissions cap on massive oil and gas corporations that would hold them to emissions targets that they promised they could achieve. And I greatly encourage you to go back and to listen to their stories. In the last few days, we thought the climate competitiveness strategy was going to be a lot worse, especially in regards to the fate of the emissions cap. Sierra Club Canada supporters like you quickly mobilized. You sent in messages and made phone calls to political leaders supporting the emissions cap, and you called for the prioritization of renewable energy, even on the day of the budget release itself. There are conflicting reports on the fate of the emissions cap, but CBC News reports the emissions cap will now effectively be a backstop to be implemented if provinces fail to reduce emissions in other ways. It isn't fully saved, but it isn't gone either, and it will continue to haunt big corporate polluters, and that's important. And that's thanks, again, to you. And even though the wins in this budget may seem small, we have to consider the larger picture. Renewable energy is rapidly becoming cheaper to implement than oil and gas development. Countries all around the world are waking up to this renewable energy revolution, despite the attempts of the US government to stall that energy transition. Renewables are rapidly becoming the default for energy development, especially across the global south. Low-cost renewable energy is soaring in China and Vietnam. Vietnam's wind and solar generation exceeds gas-fired power generation. Demand for liquefied natural gas is expected to already have peaked in Europe and South Korea. China has already surpassed its 2030 renewable energy ambitions. In fact, China installed more wind and solar power in a single year than the total amount of renewable energy currently operating in the United States. In fact, Canada actually risks losing out on the renewable future of energy and ending up reliant on China if we don't build our own independent renewable supply chains. The takeaway here is we don't need to defeat the stranglehold of the oil and gas corporations alone. The economics are already turning on them. And that's why they're trying to replace democracies with oligarchies and dictatorships around the world. It's the only thing that can slow the death of their business model. What's vital now is that we develop renewable energy rapidly in Canada so we have real independence as other countries also race to develop renewable energy dominance. The key to a successful strategy against more powerful opponents is to understand their weaknesses and where they lie, to know what you actually have to do to win. Sometimes, in order to win, you simply need to avoid losing. In a previous episode, we looked at the Battle of Trafalgar as an example of applying military doctrine to communications. Well, we can draw from another common concept in military history and apply it to communications conflicts here. In an asymmetric conflict, provided the general momentum of the situation is against them, then the conventional army, in this case wealthy interests, loses if it does not win the overall conflict. The unconventional army, that's you, wins if they do not lose the overall conflict. We don't have to defeat the anti-democratic efforts of oil and gas corporations single-handedly. We just have to weaken their grip as much as we can, everywhere we can, to hasten the demise of their business model, while also keeping them from eroding our democracies and shared sense of reality with their disinformation. And that also means emphasizing renewable energy development in places where it is most needed to replace oil and gas employment and oil and gas reliance in terms of economics. So long as democracy survives, we will win the climate change fight. But the faster we can shift to renewable energy and the faster we can deal with the extreme inequality that we're facing, the more likely it is we can keep democracy alive. And that's where you come in, causing trouble for those oil and gas interests and wealthy interests, stalling their attempts to weaken climate policies. Getting every ounce of support we can to develop renewable energies instead of oil and gas is actually a huge win, even if it seems small at the time, because it's a win amplified by the fact that the winds of renewable change are already behind us. Every worker we get into a green industry counts. Every person you talk to about disinformation counts. Every policy we can enact to give people, in general, more time, energy, and monetary means to engage with the political process relative to the ultra-rich helps. Every politician you encourage to do something brave, or at least something less worse, counts because the momentum is already on our side. What matters here is the net benefit, keeping the momentum moving in a democratic and green direction and moving things faster wherever we can. People are also waking up to the harmful effects of extreme inequality, and they are angry. The deep state, the real deep state, is in trouble. Which leads us to talking about strategy and making the most of the situation we find ourselves in. How do we hasten the dismantling of corporate power and the real deep state of wealthy interests? In talking about strategy, here are 3 things to consider. 1. Understand democracy isn't founded on the idea that our political leaders are saviors. It's the opposite. They are just representatives. You are the real saviors, and they just represent you. When we make politicians saviors in our mind, we actually give power to wealthy interests and take the first step towards authoritarianism, no matter how good those politicians are in fact. Because when we put the emphasis for change on a leader's personal character, we remove ourselves from that central role of being the ones who make the change or drive that leader to make the change. We are the saviors every time we champion the truth, counter hate and discrimination, even if it's just by talking to others about issues like climate change. 2. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for, that's up to you, but understand that even if you elect somebody you personally like, almost immediately they will be swept away into a world of corporate lobbyists, garbage advice on public opinion and communications from corporate interests, and more generally, a society of insiders. Politicians will be convinced to take positions that even may harm them by people whose loyalty is only to profit, unless you intervene to show them a better course. Politicians also will, if they're doing their job, be incredibly busy, and that will also lessen and diminish the quality of their connection to the public at large. 3. Understand that a lot of wealthy interests, oil and gas corporations being high on the list in Canada, want to erode democracy, but that they do this not only at election time by trying to convince you not to vote or that voting is pointless, but also between elections by trying to control access to politicians that normally should be speaking to you. They want more than anything to frame what politicians should see as realistic, and you have to fight their framing of situations, not work within that framing. It's the best long-term strategy both during elections and between them. So if you want to get rid of the real deep state, learn from the corporate public relations professionals who make it up. Here are 3 things to do in response to those 3 factors when it comes to changing your strategic thinking. Firstly, in order to deal with these factors, no matter who you're thinking of voting for, if you're thinking of voting for somebody, think about what they'll be like as an opponent, because no matter how much you like them, they will at times be your opponent in between that election cycle. They're not going to save the day. They're just a means to the end of you saving the day. You don't follow leaders, make them follow you. You need to keep working, too, on that community level to make change locally while also making new contacts elsewhere, working in similar causes nationally and internationally. This is not just to have a backup for when political leaders fail, but it's in order to maximize your leverage on their decision-making by building up local autonomy and interconnections between local communities that corporate voices don't control. We talk about this in a previous podcast episode called Your Community Can Drive the Transition to Renewables. Don't wait for the state. It isn't local versus national or international progress. It isn't grassroots versus political process. It isn't a choice of voting or going to protests. The best movements find how all forms of progress can reinforce each other and then use those different forms in conjunction. 2. Understand that voting is super important, but so is engaging politicians between elections. Even if you make compromises in terms of what you want to see in the short term, even if you elect someone you like, never stop advocating for more. Never appease the center of the debate. Instead, shift the center to your view of things by using framing and metaphors that match what the center will understand, but still carry a radical message. Control the narrative. Don't let it control you, because no one respects a movement or a cause that stands for nothing. Never really compromise. Treat every crisis as an opportunity. Track your wins as much as your losses. Never think that you will achieve anything unless a politician is under pressure to do even more than it. And encourage them. Make it clear to them that what is possible is much more ambitious than what they believe to be possible. Keep the ground moving in your direction, slowly or fast, depending upon the situation, but never disarm your arguments by voluntarily giving up the leverage you hold. Even if you choose not to be too radical in a situation, always have that radicality ready to go, and always try to control the framing of what is realistic and push that framing towards the truth. 3. We need our own army of lobbyists, and that army is you. You are the PR person, the lobbyist. Every time you call your elected leaders, protest outside that city council, or encourage your friends to vote, or support policies that help ease strain on people's lives and therefore give them more capacity to participate in the political process. These are general strategies, 3 of them, of which all or some may apply to what you are doing, but all of them can work in tandem. The particular tactics you use to carry them out will depend on the situation you face and what works best in that moment, as we talked about in our previous episode entitled Winning the Communications War with the US Oligarchy. I recommend you go back and listen to it for more context on the difference between strategies and tactics and how to use them in conjunction. You might also want to pick up some books from the library on corporate public relations. I personally recommend Reputation Management, The Key to Successful Public Relations and Corporate Communication by John Dorley and Helio Fred Garcia. But there are lots of resources out there. The key thing when reading them is to go beyond just thinking to yourself, wow, it's really bad what lobbyists are doing, and instead think, how can I use these strategies and tactics for the sake of environmental justice and democracy? It's amazing how many times we fail to make that connection of, this is bad, but how could I use this? Because once you start to think of the things that you're seeing as tools, once you start to think proactively about every crisis in terms of the opportunities within it, all of this stuff becomes much, much easier to do. And the amount of time spent feeling bad about a situation diminishes, and the amount of time realizing the actions you can take increases, which is more efficient. There are also other books you might have read, like Dark Money or The Captured Economy, that go into these subjects from a more academic perspective. Keep in mind that climate deniers and those trying to stop renewable energy are also increasingly involved at the municipal and provincial level, and particularly the municipal level, and that's a place that you want to be active as an advocate for renewable energy, as an advocate for environmental justice, as an advocate for climate action, as well as at that national level. And an important note in all this, remain truthful always to the best of your ability. There's no point in lying like oil and gas corporate public relations people do or those working for oligarchs do. The truth has its own momentum, even if we don't always see it. Use that momentum. Lying is a strategy, and oil and gas corporations and wealthy interests employ that strategy, but it's not a tactic. Your strategy is to champion the truth, but you can use most of their tactics for the sake of the truth as effectively as they use those tactics for the sake of lies. Depending on where you sit on the spectrum of environmental radicality, you might get the impression from all this that I am either demonizing politicians or painting a positive picture of them when I shouldn't. I don't mean to do either. They are simply human beings, given a certain amount of power. Like all of us. They run from a spectrum of deeply flawed to mildly flawed and generally good, but none of them is perfect. Even if you have political figures you love, thinking of them as perfect is neither good for you nor for them. Even if you dislike all politicians, thinking of them as either totally bad or totally perfect is not good in that case either, because it will obscure your analysis of their actions and motivations and what you should do in response. To really overcome oligarchy, we must center ourselves, our communities, our networks, be they local, national, international, as the makers of change. Then political leaders become a means to an end, one tool among many we can use in tandem to create change. Then we can confront the power of the real deep state. So stay tuned for future episodes of our Sovereignty Saturday subseries of the Environment in Canada podcast. And remember, no one is coming to the rescue, but all of us working together. Before we end today, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca with tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates. You can sign up on the homepage. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can find our donation page at sierraclub.ca, linked in the show description. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM, bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us.